it's reading from the right thing already. So we'll pull over the props, and it's going to tell you the suggestion item props, which we'll show in a second, and these are the various things we talked about. The on focus and on captured aren't in Storybook. Don't need them. I could rig up actions to where you could see that, oh, it's thinking of doing it. Not required. In this case, we'll just look at the suggestion item props, and you'll see very basic sort of primary, secondary display, which is what gets mirrored if you look at the actual elements here. I don't want to bother typing it because Storybook does it, and I'm good. So if we move on, the basic idea is then we need to create the focus suggestion. He's the same sort of layout. It's just there's more stuff. In my case, I've got a node query, which might be easier to show not through Storybook. Focus suggestion stories. Here. So this is the dynamic stuff will come later. This I already had. This was loaded initially. I'm going to fire a query to get all this. Now this is the Apollo server. Think of it as React Relay or whatever it is that makes you happy. It contains the error state, the loading state, and the data you need. And it updates itself as it goes. So this is all the pieces that actually get loaded over time, which lets you do the things you need, like the error states, loadings, and the actual data. Simple enough, off you go. And all that's wired up statically, so you're not having to deal with it. But all that's wired up statically, so you have to deal with it. And that's where you get into this kind of smarter thing that keeps all the logic. That is what I'm calling the compact suggestion controller. This we'll have to spend a little time on. First, heads up, I do use MUI theme. You use Tailwind, use whatever makes you happy. As long as it switches light, dark, and does the things and gives you a set color palette, cool. Don't recreate the internet. I do have snack bars so that you can actually say, hey, it's saved, hey, it's not saved. We'll move on from that. Animation duration is shared, and that's a bit of a state that we'll get to in a second. But in general, I've got a state tracker. We'll jump down there so you can see what state I'm actually having to keep, which is very, very little. It's either focused, expanded, and hey, what's the actual element? Focused is that stage I talked about where we're considering. We think we're going to load it. Expanded is, yeah, now that it's on the screen, it comes in exactly the shape of the other card. So if you were to slow down the animation, you'd see where when you moused over, I would find the coordinates and the shape, assign them to the focus suggestion box, opacity 0. I'm actually shifted up 1 pixel because I have some rounding issues depending on the browser. But then what happens is that it's got a negative translation on animation size. Because it has to expand outwards, it starts CSS shrunk. The whole dang thing starts shrunk. Now what that looks like, yeah, by the way, props to metal. Let's go find that animation where we focus. And the same thing happens as we're going back out so that you're aware. We have to first shrink it and then let it go. As we're doing that expansion, the bottom shows or doesn't shows. So if you came in at 100% or 0% opacity and the bottom was showing, that would suck. So you have to expand up and show separately. And then your saves controls. Now where is that animation? Oh yes, this was just the keyframe duration still incompletely. Here we go. So static props that are on this thing at all times, it's always got that negative transform, and part of this has to do with the scale ratio. When you expand it, we know roughly what it's expanding to. That's a set width. But prior to that, we're dealing with a UI where everything is responsive. So just because you think you know the width, you don't. The only two ways to manage this is either a hell of a lot of CSS calculation, Not fun. JS calculation, waste of resources. Or more importantly, aspect ratios. I don't set the width. I set, hey, here's the whole screen. Each of you gets 25%, and then they figure out from the width what they've actually got naturally width-wise. And then I tell it the aspect ratio of like 1.39, and everything lays out in a nice set size box, and you can rely on that. So you'll see a lot where everything has to do with the scale ratio because of that. Then you move on. In this case, once you start expanding, I'm going to transform. I'm going to put it at the 0 as to where it was supposed to be and start scaling it up. Once the image is loaded, I can change the opacity back in. Now this is conditional. Those are rendered based off the state as you do it, and that's all coming from that compact suggestion controller that I was talking about on the outside that's keeping track of all that business. So there's a lot there that I kind of glazed over. I know I'm probably about halfway through time, maybe more than that. What do people want to ask? Questions about C, question implementations, what you need before I walk away and let you all have fun with the code bases.
What's your date on using storyboard?
Saved me a lot of time just to get the initial visuals up, because trying to do it while I was dealing with the data loads and trying to fake it and get it into the right state was painful. And honestly, I would keep forgetting, there's this other state, and there's this other state. So it was an excellent reminder, and I can pass that off to my actual teams to say, comp showed these 2 things. Here's the 9 things. Are they good? And it's a lot easier to show them that in a screenshot rather than hoping that they get to the exact right state. Good luck. I'm a big fan of it. I do find that the maintenance on it does cost me 5% velocity, perhaps, because every time I change a type, I totally forget. Oh, it's running. It works. I can go and play with it and react when it's actually going. And then you try to build and your linter just screams at you. But hopefully you remember what you did. The cost is probably worth it. I was on 6. I tried 5. So I'd say about 2 years. Anyone else have questions on implementation details, questions on anything?
I was wondering for the animation, you tried faking it in a way. So I guess you have another component card in front of the regular component that just hides, and then you can get an animator instead of scaling. That actually look exactly how you want it.
I believe I tried something similar to that. Let me see if I understood you right. You were talking about if I were to just put my mouse over it, I could do something where this was already on the screen. Yes and no. So the issue is that expansion of the corners is what really ate you alive, because if you're trying to get it to literally grow outwards, you have to start from the same sized box, which is where that transition comes in to get it right. So I'm actually animating both vertically to keep it in the same spot and scaling to keep the corners moving. It's hard to achieve that in much other ways. I tried a couple, they didn't work perfectly. Oh, I should probably mention, Popper, but it's what we got. Love it until we have a better choice. Y'all ought to keep your eye open for CSS Anchors 2 implementation. That's built in, it'll say, hey, relative to that div right there, do your thing. And it will actually do it through CSS. No more of this awful JS wrapping business, but we're probably 6 months out. Other questions before we wrap? We have another speaker.
Are you going to tell us what startup you're...
I'm with Torch AI. It's a company out of Kansas City. I don't talk about it a whole lot.
Okay.
I'm not allowed to talk about that.
I was going to ask, it's super stealth.
We just don't talk. So I get to come and display abstracted work. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it, and let's say hi to the next speaker. What was the name of that one?
Ryan Tips. Thank you, Lance. Yes, our next speaker, next speaker is Ryan. He did show up a little late, but it's all good. No worries. And we're going to be talking about state management. Yeah.
So, sit down and I'll get you the mic.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah.
I've got the whole looking I would use Captain America.
Let's use theirs. How many notes? I've already got it. What about like
Hey, over your ear, on your pocket, press green, go. Yep.
All right. This is Ryan's first talk here at React ATX, so let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you guys for having me. Can you guys hear me audio-wise? Good? Yep, cool. Okay, give me just a second to get this going. Let's see. There we go. Let me see if there's a way that I can. Let's see, what do you guys see there? Oh, that's okay. We don't need this. Oh, here we go. There we go. All right. Okay. All right. Well, with all that, I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Ryan Tips. I've come to this meetup only a few times, but I think there were in need of people to speak, so I went ahead and volunteered. I am by no means an expert on state management. I'm still learning a lot of it. There's not even that many state management libraries that I can say I've used to a good extent to speak on. So I've tried as much as possible to do my homework and hopefully have something that's useful for everybody here, regardless of your skill level. A little bit about me. I just kind of put together on here just logos of places I've worked, where I went to school, projects I've worked on. I went to UT. I did not study computer science, studied mechanical engineering. Got into to software engineering later. I currently work here in town at a security software company called Noonlight. They are about a year ago got purchased by Alarm.com. I believe we are currently hiring a senior engineer if anyone's looking, and I think in the future, I want to say there's plans to hire more senior engineers and mid-levels. So definitely check out the career page. Some other places I've worked, or other things I've worked on. I got to work on a project for Continental Tire, fan-controlled football, the Ohio Hospital Association. I did intern at 3M, though not in a software role, but I love 3M. So anyways, all right. So what is state management? I think this is a good place to start, but before we even do that, let's do a quick little show of hands survey. So, and I just realized that this is actually not full screen, but, well, that's okay. We don't really need that. What's that? F11. Let's see. Should we try it? Let's see if it blows something up. Oh, man. And of course, I have the touch bar, so do I even have F11? No. No, that didn't work. Well, now I lost my presenter view. Okay. Let me get back to it. so quick show of hands. Let's see real quick. Raise your hand if you have ever written a single line of code. All right. Mainly making sure we're all at the right meetup. Okay, raise your hand if you have ever worked on a React app for 1 week or more. And I mean like a week as in 40 hours, the same app. Okay, so everybody here has really used React, whether it be a personal project or a work project. Okay, raise your hand if you have ever worked on a React app for 1 week or more where Redux was the primary state manager. Okay, that looks like 3/4 people have raised their hand for that. Raise your hand if you've ever worked on a React app for 1 week or more where just use state and use context and the primitive React hooks was the main state manager. Still most people, okay. And then last one, raise your hand if you've ever worked on a React app for 1 week or more where some other third-party state manager was the primary state management tool. Okay, so maybe 1/4 of people raise their hand for that, so that's interesting. There's not a huge point to that, it's just kind of interesting to see who's used what, what's popular and all that, so. All right, so back to what is state management. So I think this can kind of represent just the complexity and the confusion that can come up when you are trying to dive into state management. I made this, I just threw a bunch of terms out there. Things can get complicated if you want to make it complicated and dig deeper, and there's all these terms. And I think for certain people in like architecture roles, it's probably warranted that you understand all of the different models. If you are, setting up to build a large application that's going to be used for a long time, that's important, you probably do want to really understand things very well. But I'm going to try and break it down and be a little more high level for probably more so the typical developer. Yep.
What's the picture represent?
Oh, what does it look like? It's death and despair over complexity of things. So what is state management? I got a couple quotes here. The one on the left is from ChatGPT, but I thought it was actually pretty useful. I'm going to read this one. I promise most of the presentation, I'm not just going to be reading slides. Okay, so state management refers to the process of maintaining and controlling the state or data of a system or an application. State can represent various types of information, including user data, configuration settings, application state, and more. The concept of state management is not specific to front-end JavaScript or web development. It's a fundamental concept used throughout computer science and application development. And that's from ChatGPT. There's another quote related to it that I got from a Jack Harrington video. If you guys know him, the Blue Collar Coder YouTube channel is really great stuff. I really liked how he kind of related React and state management. So he said, state and state management is the beating heart of a React app. State is the engine that moves your React app. React's whole job is to turn state into HTML. And that's kind of, it's not literally true, but it's in an approximate sense, I think that's helpful to think of things that way. So there are many different ways to break down state management libraries. There's tons of different models, and even I think it was confusing as I was just researching and preparing to give this talk. If you go to sort of the more well-known names in the React community and look at sort of their take on state management, a lot of them don't even use the same terminology, and I think they all acknowledge that. A lot of them will categorize things differently. Jack Harrington has a state management overview video on YouTube where he breaks things down into I want to say 6 or 7 different categories. Other folks like Lee Robinson or Theo Brown break them down into fewer. I kind of like breaking them down into fewer, and then you can sort of divide them further as is warranted. So just at risk of being too broadly stroked, I'm going to try and say that most state management libraries or approaches are going to fall into kind of one of these 2 ways of doing things. And at least this next slide, this really isn't even limited to React. This is just state management in general. And so what that is basically I would summarize this as, are you going to let your state be, are you going to allow your state to be directly edited by the application, like the consuming application that uses it? Or are you going to create an interface around your state and require that your application work through that interface to manipulate and manage that state? Okay, so I would call the first one the more atomic approach, meaning atomic as in any change you make to a state variable does not rely on the previous state. Now, what that really means is a lot of times the state that you want to update does actually depend on the previous state. So if your state management solution doesn't account for that, then that means that, in React, your components need to actually account for that, right? So you can use this more atomic approach where you kind of just have individual variables, state variables that are reactive. But when things, as oftentimes are, state is related or there's correlated state. And so if you have correlated state, but your state manager doesn't do that, then you need to manage that complexity yourself. So that's where a lot of times people will use effect to make side effects happen. If you want to update one state variable, but you have a related thing to update, you need to do that too. And I wrote use state is a primitive example of this approach. I don't mean primitive in a bad way. It's just sort of the most fundamental example of this sort of atomic approach. I'll go into a little bit more later of libraries that I would say also fall into this category. Then on the other hand, you have what I described as having an interface. I would call this sort of a more state machine approach. What is confusing is that, and if anyone has a better term for this, please let me know or suggest it. State machine has a textbook definition in computer science and really even in information science. You don't need computers to have a state machine. The classic example is like those subway turnstiles where it can go forward, but it can't go backward. And what is it? If you've already started going forward, I forget how that works, but you get the idea. There's sort of mechanical implementations of state machines. It's not just a computer thing. So there is a textbook definition of a state machine. I'm using it here in a more loose sense. Obviously, the state management approaches that are more strict, I would kind of group into here. But I think it's helpful to sort of think of things as these state management approaches that have more of an interface. They more manage the state for you and provide an interface for your components or your application to work through. So let's go through. I have just two examples just to kind of get at this a little bit further. Let's say you have a React app, or really it doesn't even have to be a React app. It could be any application. Let's say it's like a racing simulator, right? So you have these go ahead, yep.
I would probably call it encapsulated state.
Encapsulated state, yeah, I think that's a fair way, yeah. I'm just curious, do you personally put a lot of weight on the term state machine? Do you like, does that mean something to you, or is that kind of one of the wordy, nerdy terms that doesn't get used?
It does absolutely mean something to me. But encapsulated, the way, a class would be encapsulated data.
Absolutely,
So
yep.
I'm thinking of it from that perspective for the naming, but yeah. I've implemented quite a few state machines. So yeah, that means something to me that to me is separate. You would want encapsulated state to build a state machine.
Right.
But they're not.
Encapsulation of state itself does not necessarily make a state machine. In that sense, Redux could be used to implement a state machine, but not necessarily. Would you agree with that? Yeah, okay, I think that's totally fair. So you could say encapsulated state. So I'm going to continue on with this example. Encapsulated state, maybe you have all these underlying things that you need to keep track of for your racing game. You have the position, the direction of the car, the speed, the acceleration, and that acceleration could be a computed value that depends on a lot of other things. But then the interface that you might want to expose is much simpler. You might not want individual, sort of the UI of your program to be updating, for example, the position, because it would need to have all the logic to calculate that. maybe the next position is based off of the speed, the acceleration, the traction of wherever the vehicle currently is. It could be an engine curve. There's a lot of complexity there. So this is just kind of belaboring the encapsulation idea. Other example, since a lot of times I would say React is mostly not used to make games. So here's an alternative example, an audio player. You have a lot of underlying state, playback status, playback position, etc. And you have sort of the interface that you expose, play and pause buttons, skip previous. You might want to toggle the playback speed, toggle lyrics, or like Spotify has that sort of canvas, for example, where it plays a short little video clip.
Also, you
Oh, go ahead.
encapsulated on the slide.
I did. No, I agree with you. I spent a while trying to come up with that terminology. Yeah, I want to say that in my admittedly limited experience, it seems like most of the time when state is encapsulated, it seems like it's more used in sort of a state machine sense. Maybe not a strict like every application, every piece of the application has a defined, strictly defined state, and there's movement between this position and this state item. But that's been my experience, again, limited. But I definitely appreciate anyone else's comments on that. So.
Yeah, the movement between states is to me the most important part of the state machine. And so that's why it needs.
Fair, I think fair enough. Yeah. Other question?
Just a clarification question.
Mhm.
Are the racing sim example and the audio player both state machine approaches?
The way that I am describing it, where there's underlying state, but then sort of an interface that you're exposing, that's what I mean by, I'll go ahead and adopt the encapsulated term. Whether you want to call it a state machine or an encapsulated approach, yes. You could implement these as in just an atomic sense, where you say, let's take the audio player example. You could implement something where when your UI decides to, or your UI allows the user to skip ahead in a song, and it sort of manages all of the side effects of what happens. Maybe if you skip ahead more than 30 seconds, there's an ad that pops up. And so then you would have to handle like, okay, well now we need to trigger the ad popping up. You could implement them anyway, but I think these sort of examples, they give you an idea of why you would want to have sort of this abstraction on top of the underlying state.
Oh, so the state or the atomic or state approaches are independent. I mean, these examples are independent of those two approaches, you're saying?
You could build anything with any approach, I would say. It's more of a question of what are you building and what sort of, what model makes the most sense. Okay, so then there is a related topic to all of this, and I think this has become much more talked about in the past few years, and that is this sort of notion that there is your application state, but there really also is sort of server state, or you could call it remote state, or some people just refer to this as like data fetching. But you have a lot of state that isn't really inherently local application state. It's more so state that you've created around synchronizing your application's local data to remote data. But if you had like a perfect connection of data, I don't mean like in a technical sense, I just mean if conceptually, like if you just had access to that remote data, then all of this state would go away because you would just have the remote data. So that's where, I'll go ahead. There's a little history bit here. This is actually, I believe, a fake tweet. I don't think Dan actually tweeted this, but he pretty much has sort of shared this sentiment. You can stop using Redux. This is not meant to bash Redux. I think Redux added a lot of value. Actually, let me talk about this on my next slide. And again, the point of this slide, the point of talking about Redux right now, is not really to talk about Redux. The point is sort of the history of the React ecosystem. When React first came out, it was mostly used class components. The built-in state management hooks were much more limited, and even just the third-party libraries around state management and data fetching and form states and URL state, these were much more limited. So Redux was one of the early state management libraries that was on the scene and kind of won in popularity. And I think it's not that Redux was bad. I think the issue is that Redux then was the only way to do a lot of things. Yes, state management, but also data fetching and just managing sort of simple state around what characters are typed into a form field. And I think it really served well for all those things when that was maybe the best way to do it. But over time, the ecosystem has grown, and there are a lot of better ways to do these other related things. So that is sort of the context of Dan Abramov's sentiment of you can stop using Redux now. And we'll get to what sort of the recommendation of what to do instead in a minute. And then just a little caveat that Redux is by no means dead. It's still, I think it's, at this point, maybe you could say most people would prefer to use a more recent library that they like better, for ease of use or for whatever reason, but there are tons of apps out there that are running Redux. There are still apps where people are doing, engaging in new developments where they say, hey, we've already used Redux, so let's build off of this architecture decision that we made. So again, the point really is not, there's nothing wrong with Redux. The point is, don't use, there are other solutions to do things that you don't need a state management library for at this point. Yeah, question back there?
What is the axis here? Is that like NPM downloads or?
What's that? Oh, the vertical axis?
Yeah, is that NPM downloads?
Yeah, yes, sorry, this is NPM trends, yeah. Which, and good point or thank you for pointing that out. That, NPM trends reflects, I believe it's literally download instances, correct?
Yep.
Which does not necessarily mean that does not reflect people continually making decisions. It's more of like I guess you could say like a lagging indicator, if that makes sense.
I think people learn React, and the next step is learn Redux, and they download it, but they don't use it maybe, so it's just people who touched Redux.
Yes, exactly, that's true. Oops, that one's not supposed to be in there. So this, I put in this slide just as an example of, to tease out a little bit more of the differences of when you would say is this state that we're currently maintaining, is this really server state? Can we just sort of offload that and say it's server state and then use a data fetching library to handle it? I think good examples of server state are social media posts. It could be like the status of an e-commerce order. It could be real-time data, such as like a leaderboard, that's changing in real time. It could even be like a WebSocket-based thing. Weather data. These are all good examples of information that is really not, there's nothing that is inherently tied to the local browser, right? Then you have application state, which is things, I think classic examples of that would be like, is there a modal open right now? And if so, which one is it? Is there a light mode or dark mode enabled? What's kind of the state of the media player here? Is it paused? Is it scrubbing? Is it waiting for more clips of audio or video to download? Or local game, a lot of games are local focused. So I think these are good examples of when data is inherently part of what is running in front of you on your lap in your computer. Okay, so state management today. I'm going to try and give sort of a high-level overview of this. Bear with me. Again, I'm by no means an expert on this. There's tons of solutions out there as far as like the third-party libraries. Just quickly, a recap of the React primitives. You have use state, use reducer, and use ref. I would say those are the three main hooks that React gives you to manage actual state. The difference between them being use state is sort of that more atomic approach. Use reducer is that more encapsulated approach. You could use it to build a state machine. Use ref is much like use state, except React is set up to not respond. It does not react to changes to use ref. Then you have other hooks that are like use memo, use callback, use effect that help you respond to state changes and perform actions on their behalf or update other things like derived values based on the underlying state. And then you have, I kind of thought of it as hooks that just make doing other things easier, right? So that's your use context, or excuse me, your use context. It lets you share a hook or other function that accesses a hook throughout multiple components in your application. You have custom hooks that let you encapsulate other hooks that you have and share them around in your application. Okay, so examples of the atomic approach to state management. Use state and use context is that, right? You have individual state values. You can, set them. Your React app will respond when they're changed. You can then use context to share it throughout multiple components in your application. As far as actual third-party libraries, Recoil and Jotai, I think, are probably the most notable examples. Recoil is a little bit older, was created by Facebook. Jotai is a little bit newer. I think it's fair to say it's probably simpler and better maintained. And it seems like the sort of, reputable people in the React ecosystem would prefer Jotai over Recoil today. But both of these have the concept of atoms, where they're just individual pieces of state, much like use state, except you can share them throughout your application. There is I would say, one thing to be careful of with use context, and that's around if you have multiple things inside of a use context, you can run into an issue where if you have a bunch of things that are consuming that context, then anytime anything inside of that one context changes, it will trigger a re-render of any component that is consuming it, even if that component is not consuming the data that actually changed. So I have a slide at the end of like sort of common mistakes and how to avoid them. So I'll come back to that one later. Then I have the state machine approach, which I think we could call the encapsulated approach. I'm borrowing some of these terms from Jack Harrington. He broke them down this way, categorized them like this. You have your unidirectional data flow. Redux is a good example of this. It's the traditional, you have actions, you dispatch the actions, that sort of decides how to respond. It updates the state, and then your application responds to that one single update. You have bidirectional reactive models. I cannot speak too much to these. I've not used anything in this model before. Some notes I took for the bidirectional model, there's MobX and Valtio. MobX, I think, is a little bit older and probably has more users. Relies on native JavaScript classes. You wrap your components in observer functions. Valtio is similar to MobX. I believe it is also made by the same Poimanders team that made Zustand and Jotai. I could be wrong on that. There is the reactive approach. Akita and RxJS would take that approach. Then there is what I would say is a more true textbook definition of a finite state machine. And to your point earlier, you could use Redux to implement a finite state machine. XState is, I think, the best example where it sort of forces you to be very, very precise in defining your individual states, right? So you would define, and you can sort of make this for multiple different, pieces or modules of your application, but you would define, for any given thing that you want to control the state of, you can define specific states, and you have to map out what are the ways to get from this state, from state A to state B, and then XState has a lot of tools to help you visualize that. It can make diagrams for you, so you can kind of map out like, okay, what are the ways to get from this point to this point? What are the side effects that happen at each of these steps? What data are we actually maintaining at each of these steps? So it is a good option if that's the approach you want to take. Then third, I know I mentioned earlier the idea of sort of stripping out your data fetching outside of your state manager. You don't need to use a state manager if you just have data that you want to fetch. And, excuse me, if you are using a state manager for that, there's really a lot of complexity around data fetching, right? There's loading status. What happens, what happens when your fetch fails? Do you want to do retries? Do you want to do the sort of exponential back off? There's a lot of things like that that can make data fetching more complex. I didn't even mention caching or mutations where you can kind of invalidate your cache of data. So I think React Query is, I would say, is the best library to use for any kind of remote data fetching. And that could be data that you're fetching from your own server, or it could be from third-party data. Use SWR is a similar but more limited library by the Vercel team. And then you have the Apollo client for GraphQL, which would be kind of the go-to solution to use if the data that you're fetching is GraphQL based. So I have some recommendations. You guys might disagree with them, but I've tried to sort of reflect what I think is probably most people in the industry would agree with. First is this great meme that I found. It's the little bell curve where there's the kind of the unintelligent person on the left who's like, just use hooks. Then you have the person who's trying too hard and implements all of these crazy solutions, and then you have this sort of legendary master who's like, yeah, just use hooks. This is not to say, this is a joke, but I think it does capture something real of, we don't want to introduce complexity when it's not merited, right? And that kind of brings me to my recommendation, which again, I think you guys might all agree with. Tell me if you don't. I think the vast majority of apps do not have enough complex state that it merits anything more than the built-in hooks for state management, combined with a data fetching, like a robust data fetching library, like React Query, but you could use GraphQL, the Apollo client for GraphQL, or use SWR. I would say for the majority of apps, this is all you need. If you need to add in, if you need something more complex, if you need more, more features, add in a third-party state management library. I think it is helpful, and I'll touch on this in the next slide of common mistakes. I think it's helpful to recognize in advance, to say like, hey, this is the application that we're building. Maybe you're projecting this out over the next year or two, and to say like, hey, could we get away with use state today and the built-in native hooks? Yes. In a year from now, are we going to be regretting that we built so much of the application in sort of a spaghetti code way? I think it's worth thinking through that and then deciding, if we're going to need a state management solution, like a third-party library for that, let's start looking into that today so that you don't get to a point where you have spaghetti code and then you have to refactor everything into a state management, a third-party library. That'd be my recommendation. Obviously, there's always, business sort of wins. So whenever there's a business need, you kind of got to roll with what you have funding for. So yeah, go ahead. It's Lance, right?
Yeah. Probably one other thing that hasn't come up, but is state management, is the URL. React Router and other things are a great place, especially if you're anticipating any sort of sharing or bookmarking.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think I was not around in the development world back when Redux was like sort of the real main recommended way to do things. But at that, correct me if I'm wrong, at that point, you probably would have used Redux to manage that. Is that right?
React Router would have gotten most of that. Redux separate, usually for more like object classes.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, thanks, Lance. So let's go into common mistakes. I've got a list here. I'm going to run through it real quick, and this is basically will be basically the last slide in my presentation. Common mistakes to avoid, and after that, please feel free, if anyone has just from their own experience other things that they want to share, please do so. So let's take a look. The first one I mentioned it earlier. If you have this idea of like, well, hey, let's stick all our state for the application inside of a single context. Let's wrap the entire app inside of that, and then everything can subscribe to that context. The issue with that is there's no way to just sort of key into individual changes of the specific things inside of that context. I had heard that there was discussion of React adding a separate hook to basically what you want there is a selector. I believe Redux has that concept of that. Other libraries do as well, where you can say, I don't want to just subscribe to any old change in state in my store. I only want to subscribe to changes to this particular value that I care about. So I want to say React had some discussion of adding that into their native hooks. I don't know what happened to that. I tried Googling it and couldn't find anything. So as of now, there's not a native way to do that. The solution is break things up into multiple contexts so that you can subscribe to them individually. And when I say subscribe, I just mean consume, having a component that consumes those contexts. The second two are related, and that is a common mistake is using a state management library for data fetching. And that goes for other things that there are better tools out there for. Another one is using useEffect for data fetching. Does it work? Yes, but does it really work? Not really. There are just so many edge cases around it, around data fetching, that if you're using useEffect, you probably are in a scenario where you don't care about those edge cases, or you you really should just be using a data fetching library at that point. I have third grouping here, using complex state managers to handle applications that really just have simple state and don't warrant it. And similar is avoid using simple state management solutions when your state actually is complex. I want to say there's some quote from Albert Einstein. I'm sure it's probably not even, I don't know, sometimes these quotes go around and it's like you look it up and it's like, he never said that. But I remember the quote was something like, make everything as simple as possible, but not any simpler, right? So if the problem you're trying to solve is actually complicated, don't pretend it's simpler, right? You're introducing more complexity by pretending it's simpler. And then related to that, I say be wary of technical debt that you can get into by just saying like, well, hey, what we have works today. Let's just incrementally add to that. Then you can kind of dig yourself into a hole and get to a point where, the amount of work to refactor and to use the correct solution is just, this astronomical cost, and it's just unobtainable then. And then the very last one is to, when possible, try and avoid mixing UI logic and business logic too much. I put in kind of like a silly example of if you have an on-click handler that computes the very next move of a chess game, right? You probably want that logic not in there. So that's basically it. I would love to hear if anyone has other common mistakes that they've run into and want to share with the group, or if anyone has a particular state management library or the way they think of it that they want to share, please share it. I think we're all here to learn. So with that, if anyone has any questions or comments, yeah, go ahead.
So how would you handle data fetching if you don't use a query library, and if you say we avoid and use effect, we are not using query library? There's a way to kind of approach data fetching in a reasonable way, or
I think if you are avoiding using a query library, the way to do it would be with useEffect, but you would probably have to sort of build in the robustness of what happens when you get not a 200 response from that fetch. What happens when there's something else? What do you want to do then? Does your application break? Do you retry? There's a lot of things around that you probably want. And I think these libraries they're fairly lightweight, and they sort of abstract that away for you. You don't have to worry about them. So I don't see a huge reason to not use them, other than people might not be familiar with them. But that's anything, I think it helps to be just open-minded and willing to try new stuff.
mechanism that is used under the hood in those libraries? I assume they somehow tracking those life cycles, again using useEffect.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Probably, yeah, I'm sure like React Query, for example. I don't know if they're using useEffect under the hood. I would guess they are. It's not so much about useEffect being inherently bad. It's just sort of treating it as though oh, you fetch the data, and of course we're going to get the response, and then we'll just stick it in our state variable. When in reality, if you care about your application, if it's actually important, there's probably edge cases where you want to handle things differently. But yeah, under the hood, I'm sure I don't know, but I would guess they're using use effects, but with a lot of other conditionals and logic around it. Yep.
Okay, so you're talking about subscribing to one piece of data that's going to change. Is that similar to use signal or like pre-act use signal? The concept of not destroying a whole component, but subscribing to one variable. Is that kind of the same?
Sure. I don't know a huge amount about signals. I mean, I'm curious about Solid.js, which kind of runs with that idea.
Pre-act has got
Yeah. Yeah, I can't speak to it. Yeah, all I can do is clarify, when I say subscribing, again, I mean, if you have one one context provider of your whole app where you have basically an object in there and you have a bunch of data, individual, oftentimes unrelated data that you stick in there, and then you have multiple things that consume that, you update one of those things and anything that's using that context at all is going to re-render. And you can run into issues. I was working on a calendar app like 6 months or so ago where we had so much spaghetti of different things that were inside of that one context provider that were really not related. That one thing would update, that would cause a component to re-render. As a side effect, it would also update something in that context. And then that would happen, another component would update because of that. And so you would get into this infinite render loop. And it was a pain to debug that. Yep, back there.
So are you using Sustain?
I am not. I primarily have used Jotai or just the built-in hooks in React. Zustand, have you heard Zustand? I've heard Zustand. I don't know how to say it. I've heard it's a German word, I believe, that means state. Yeah, it seems like it's pretty popular. I think I've heard a lot of people recommend it. I know Jack Harrington, Theo Brown recommend it. I want to say, yeah, I don't want to speak beyond that, but I know it's pretty well liked. Yep.
I was going to say, based on what you said earlier, I usually do the context provider
Mhm.
rather than their app, but I use reducer. So that way you can dispatch just like action, just like Redux. So that way it doesn't change everything else.
So then in your components that are consuming,
So I have a store which has the use reducer, and every other apps can access it through context and dispatch actions. So
Can you
that
repeat
way,
the question?
oh, I'm sorry. Say it again. He's saying he has, are you talking about the idea of using use context but having use reducer hooks inside of there? I'm a little confused on, do you mean, like, let's say you have a component that wants to update state in some way. How does it do that? Does it subscribe to the context?
dispatch the action, but it will subscribe to the context, but use reducer of the deal.
Gotcha. So then,
Technically do what it does.
I gotcha. Yep. That makes sense. So in other words, what he's saying is using use reducer,
And use context.
dispatching things that will happen inside of that context, but from a component that is not actually consuming that context.
No.
Correct. Yeah. So in other words, he's basically saying that you can have a context with maybe a couple of components that consume that context. Then you have other adjacent components that want to update state, and he's saying he's talking about using reducer functions to dispatch actions into that context. So that way you can sort of trigger logic to happen, state to change in there from a component that's not actually subscribed to it. So yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So you can subscribe to, but you want update if you're subscribing to some other variable, because the object user you want trigger and everything else too. So it's kind of like a tricky way to do this.
I'm not 100% following. Maybe if you show me afterwards what you mean, that'd be interesting. Anybody else?
So actually, like that kind of like dispatch action, kind of like with the Redux way, like back in the day, like doing it, it's pretty simple with Sustain and with this thing which is called like shallow. Basically, whatever you're consuming, like you are subscribed to that, and that dispatcher won't trigger a re-render. So it's pretty simple with Sustain. Immer, just a library that makes even like all these like use reducers, like even like ways to update.
How do you spell Emer?
Immer, I think it's with all M.
IMMER? Awesome. Okay, have you built some applications with Zustand?
Yeah, but I mean, so my local like context is like pretty simple and clean, like nothing like rocket science.
Yeah.
React works and it doesn't trigger like re-render.
Great. Having used Zustand a few times, is that kind of your, if you're starting a new React app, would that be your recommended state manager?
It's great, it's pretty simple, and actually something like weird that I found at the beginning is like you don't have to wrap it on their like a provider. By
Yeah.
default, you can do it, but it's pretty simple.
Yeah, I want to say Jotai is the same way, where you can use a context provider given by Jotai, but you don't have to. And that confused me. I was like, how is it getting that data? But I'm assuming it's doing it through JavaScript just outside of React, I'm guessing. Cool. Anybody else? Yep.
One thing, I've been working with sort of just Redux for a long time, just because the companies I joined all just embedded
Yeah.
in the stack. And I think like one of the big benefits is the tooling around debugging. I work on React Native apps, and the debuggers work across web and native. I wonder, debugging and other sorts of tooling like that outside of just the app. How does that factor into when you're thinking about like what state management library? to
Yeah,
use?
I mean, I think that's a great point. So if anyone didn't hear, what he's saying is where he's worked, the tech stack is pretty heavily invested into Redux, but it's very valuable to them because of the debuggers that you get. Are you talking specifically about like the Redux dev tools, like for Chrome, that sort of thing?
Yeah, time travel, being able to dispatch actions from outside your app, like stuff like that.
Oh, wow, that is cool.
Found it very helpful. So I haven't used Zustand or in a lot of the Jotai or any of them, so I'm curious, like, are they all on par with Redux in terms of like the ecosystem? and the
I would
tooling?
guess not, in that sense that that's something I'm aware of, that Redux, because it's been used by so many technology companies for so long, there's a huge ecosystem around it of, I want to say, plugins. Is that a concept in Redux? Is that right?
Yeah, middleware, I think.
Middleware, okay. Yeah, so I'm sure it's going to be ahead of the other solutions in terms of the ecosystem around it. Yeah, it's a good point. Yep.
Tiers in your slides would be provided?
I can give you a link to it. And I had on, I think it was on my first slide. I'll go back to the beginning. My email and my LinkedIn is down there. So if anyone wants to connect, always looking to meet other developers, and happy to share what I know and would love to know what you know about anything related to React. Yep.
Could you hop over to the first slide after this?
This thing?
This one is missing an infinite re-render stack.
Yeah. Yeah.
The next one after this, actually. The atomic one.
Oh,
So
we're,
how would you build a whole meaningful application, like an actual production application with use state everywhere? It seemed like one of these early slides kind of implied that was possible, but like, how would you ever? Props traded.
So his question is, how would you build an application with just use state? So you would use, I mean, the old school way is prop drilling, right? No one would do that now. You would use a use context. I think it'd be reasonable to say, we're just going to have a bunch of context providers for sort of the related state modules. And then you're coupling, re-renders to components based off of the related state. I think that's okay to do. But I'm not trying to get you to not use a state management library. Like, I just think a lot of times you don't really need it. A lot of applications are fairly simple.
We found use context totally sufficient for my company. Just 5, 10 providers at the top level, and just we need 5, and just covers most of the cases and call it a day.
Yeah.
Dispatch to what you need, and it pulls slices everywhere and updates what it needs to update.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That the previous, not where I'm currently at, but my previous job was in consulting, so we would work on generally smaller scale projects, but you'd go through a lot of them, which kind of has its trade-offs, pros and cons of that. But the applications, because they were smaller scale, they tended to be simpler. We generally just would use context with use state in it. I would bring in Jotai if I wanted something more global and just wanted to isolate things. I had to do that with that calendar app that I talked about earlier, where it just got to be just a mesh of interrelated re-render triggers and all that. So, anybody else? We're probably getting close to time. Yeah, go ahead.
How use context works with TypeScript? Is it good? Because I tried it and it was hell because I couldn't find the information on the website, the official website, how to mutate the state. You need to create the ways.
Interesting. I don't have a great answer for that off the top of my head, but I'm sure. Lance, are you ready to answer that?
Sure. So you'll have to do some manual typing, but you can declare the context itself when you say create context. You give it the interface of here's all the things and what they'll be doing. If you really want to, you could obviously make a property like is showing, boolean, set is showing. The types for that are dispatch, set state action, boolean. If you want to learn those,
Yeah, I mean, I did it. I just want to know, will it like that at every step? So I mean, use context with TypeScript is good, or
it's
just
fantastic. I've had very few issues. The biggest problem I've ever had with context was some of the loading states. If I had the context creation and the context provider in the same file, I would lose the context. When I hot reloaded, it was fine in production, but God help you locally. Otherwise, TypeScript has always sent the types down really, really well with no issues. You just have to be pretty careful with the types. Check a few of my code bases. There's examples for you.
All right. We're good? We're good?
Yep, I think we're about time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. If you do need a voucher, let me know. I got the tickets right here. I don't need any ones. And please join us for a drink in a little bit right now. Thanks for anyone coming out. Have a good night.
I do want to go talk to him. That was like the quintessential
Oh, okay.
I just on my way of like going.
wow, wow, wow.